Okay, welcome back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a podcast hosted by Wally, and this is a ongoing conversation with leaders and community evangelists about the challenges of navigating an effective accessibility strategy. In these episodes, guests share their journey of successes and setbacks with a primary focus on how they've overcome specific issues that could have ended the company. I'm our host, Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally, and today I'm joined by Claudio Luis Vera. Claudio, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Brian, it's great. It's great. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am Claudio Luis Vera, and I am an accessibility consultant. I write and I present and teach a lot on accessibility. So I guess that would make me an evangelist as well. And lots of times, I would like to think of myself as an innovator, where I'm trying to come up with new ways or new directions for accessibility to go, and, a little bit of a thought leader for that. But I feel like I've had 9 lives and several careers before this one. And so I guess one place to see all that stuff is on LinkedIn. And if anybody's interested enough to want to reach out to me after this, that would be probably the best place to do so.
Awesome. Well, Claudio, we have a pretty jam-packed conversation today, so I want to get into things. And you hit the nail on the head being both an expert and an evangelist. Thank you for helping to educate the community. How did you get into accessibility? Kind of walk me through the timeline and your entry point into the space.
So, a lot of times I refer to myself as like a recovering designer. I worked in UX for about 20 years. And I almost feel reluctant to say past tense because, I'm still doing stuff and still designing things and still working in Figma and stuff. But I started in UX design. I owned a series of web firms in the 90s and the 2000s and even into the teens. And, working as a creative director or as a lead on like large engagements and stuff. But I think my first exposure to accessibility was a friend of mine, invited me to go over to the W3C. He had set up a meeting with Judy Brewer, who was one of the founders of the Web Accessibility Initiative. So we go into her office and I was totally excited about this. And I thought it was like really wonderful. I go back to the studio and go like, okay, well, how do we apply this into our work? And so I kind of told myself, well, whenever the budget allows or the timelines allow, we're going to work accessibility into this. And I think this is the fallacy everybody falls into now, because in the kind of 20 years that I was working in accessibility after that, I can tell you that happened exactly 0 times. So
yeah,
it's
I was going to stop you. I'm like, wait, it's not about economics and time.
It takes extra effort. It takes some level of commitment. And if you don't have a mandate, or if you think this is like, okay, you're going to sprinkle some dust at the end to make something accessible, that's not the way to go about it. You really need to budget it and work it in from the beginning.
Yeah.
So then, I don't know, I'd been at UX design for a long time. I kind of was getting a little frustrated that everything that I built was being torn down within 3 years. That's just kind of the way it goes in UX. And so I wanted to work on something that was more permanent and had a little bit more like significance socially. And that's kind of how I picked up accessibility. And then to kind of cross over into the field, I was like, well, I need some sort of credentials. So one of the tools I was working with off the bat, Wave, it's like a free it's a free accessibility testing tool that WebAIM puts out. And I basically emailed these guys and I said, well, this is kind of like an open source project. Can I contribute to it? And so what I offered to contribute was a whole new front end for Wave. And they're like, well, yeah, nobody's ever offered to do this before. So I ended up redesigning the whole front end to Wave and Figma, contributing the designs, and they pretty much, went with them almost as is. So if you were to go into Wave 2.0 now, that would be my design, my front end, that I had built up. And that was, I'd say, like 7 or 8 years ago. So it hasn't really evolved much since then, but but there it is. And then, you know, once I had those sort of credentials, I could leverage that into being like accessibility, spearheading accessibility at a major cruise firm, which I did. And that was amazing. That was like, I kind of felt like a kid in a candy store because you're working at this huge enterprise. You got 75,000 people, 60 ships, and you're dealing with technology that's shipboard, that's on the web, that's mobile. You're doing kiosks, XR, and I was embedded inside of a team that was handling accessibility like on the physical end. So you start seeing like the connections between physical accessibility, front end accessibility, and then how do you design your systems, your service design, or your back end to work with that? And all of that is integrated. So stuff like WCAG or web accessibility, I mean, it's just one real part of the equation.
Yeah, I feel like it's so powerful. I mean, you're one of several people in the series of conversations I've had in the last week that talk about how important it is to think about the physical and digital experiences together. I know it's like, but some brands are born digital only now, and a lot of the traffic for even retail stores has transitioned online. So it's like, where do you focus it? But I think that broad range of experience, it's like it carries over, right? Like what you learn in the physical challenge space is applicable to digital, and yeah, I would say designing the Wave front end probably gave you pretty good credentials to go and write the history now.
I mean, it was a fun project. I absolutely had a blast, and I actually started revisiting it, so I could like practice with design systems and that sort of thing. But that nexus between the physical world and the real world, like when I do workshops and when I teach, one of my favorite exercises to do is tell my students like, hey, imagine you're a blind person, you're at home, your fridge is empty, you need to restock it. Let's do a journey map of how you would get stuff back in your fridge. And then you start realizing that you could use certain technologies like seeing AI to go to the store and work with it, but you got to get there. Or you can order online, but you still run into all kinds of barriers if the app isn't totally accessible. So it makes people like super aware about how a lot of times that even if you do have one portion of your experience that is totally conformant with accessibility guidelines, you could still have total barriers completely blocking somebody from moving along in your customer journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think it hits the nail on the head that the usability, the fact that the product functions or a site experience is in an experience that is equal to all and suitable for all. It's go try to put the cheese back in the refrigerator. It's like, it's not happening. I can't do it.
Right. So yeah, I mean, you really do have to think about it like as end to end. So kind of when you start looking more macro, you start looking at like customer journeys or like the end to end experience. Really, if we're only focusing on the digital side of it, it's kind of like you're just doing component testing. You're just testing one part of it. You're not functionally testing the whole end to end experience.
So you've been in accessibility for a few years now. To add some humor, you've seen a lot of good successes. You've seen a lot of the challenges. Let's maybe talk a little bit about what it was like. In 2017. Here we are, several years later. Many years later, probably still dealing with some of the same challenges, which beating your head across the wall, but scaling, managing the accessibility strategies. Let's start like at the top level, like macro issues that you see that we're facing today still.
Okay, awareness is probably way up there.
Yeah.
For those of us that are in the accessibility field, there's always that like, so what are you doing now? Question that someone might ask you at Thanksgiving. And here you are trying to explain what accessibility is to your old aunt or something. So like awareness is like really not there. But imagine, I was transitioning, career wise, and that's in South Florida. And, the business scene, the tech scene here was kind of like the Thanksgiving table. Nobody had any clue what this was. So I kind of had to like build up awareness from scratch. So, I was lucky enough to be able to like talk a lot, or do a lot of speaking within like the UX circle and community down here, teaching at some of the tech boot camps and stuff. So now it's kind of like, 3 to 5 years later, I was like, oh yeah, you need to talk to Claudio. He's the accessibility guy. But it's great for me. But on the other hand, I would love to see like a whole cadre or a whole cohort of accessibility professionals that are doing great and, like really employed at high paying jobs down here. So it hasn't quite worked out that way.
Well, I think it's awesome to have specialists that are a senior developer with hyphen accessibility. But I think you said it early on, which is like those that just incorporate. It's almost like when you join a company, it's like, hey, here's our company handbook, here's our company culture, here's how these are the personas that we target, and let's just every role should get a little bit of exposure, because in many conversations that I have, it's almost like, well, folks that are blind or deaf are those with accessibility challenges. And I think I was reading, if I'm correct, like somewhere like 40% of iPhone users use at least one accessibility preference. There's like 65 accessibility preferences. So it goes far beyond that. So it's, yeah, I mean.
Yeah, hello. If you're over 55, the chances are 50% or greater that you have at least one disability. And the older you get, you just start layering them on, like a stack of pancakes almost.
So education and awareness, I mean, I think that was an easy one to start with. What are the hard ones? What do we need to tackle?
I don't think the economics are there yet. So accessibility is a cost center, or people look at it as a cost center. And part of it is maybe because we're not accounting for it right. Because, if you're an accessibility professional, then you're in the business of fixing accessibility issues and reducing the amount of technical debt that you have related to accessibility. But if you don't know you had that debt in the first place, then your company is going in with the assumption that their debt in that regard is zero. So it's easy, well, if I have zero technical debt and you're coming in to fix stuff, well, then you're a cost center. And instead, it really should be looked at, as like a cost saving business unit.
Yeah, or even revenue generating, because if you're an e-commerce business and you have this qualified buyer coming to your site that can't navigate it, well, that's missed dollars. So
it is, and then there's, you and I have talked about this before, where you have like the funnel and you have people going into the funnel, and accessibility barriers are basically blockers to that funnel. So if you have somebody with a disability, that funnel is like, it's game over. You can't proceed any further. If you're looking at everybody from a macro point of view, then you're basically, you've got lower conversion rates because of like totally fixable code issues normally. And the hard thing is like, what's missing in a lot of that whole conversation, a lot of that whole analysis is data. Like we don't know how many disabled customers we have, how many disabled customers we're turning away. I mean, that data is not there, in part because people, if you ask somebody if they're disabled, they're not going to answer it honestly a lot of times, because you don't want to disclose, and you don't want to disclose because you're either in denial or because you don't trust the person that you're disclosing to. And so self-disclosure is not a good way of doing it. But at that, you need to check for bias in your system. There's a lot of stuff now with AI that's coming out where you can start looking at the fairness of what you're doing. But you have to go into the assumption that there is this large pool of people that aren't interacting with your brand, that aren't doing business with you, and that you don't know how big they are. And you don't have any means of measuring them or the amount of revenue that you lost by not being accessible. So that's kind of like the really tough economic question that we have, in the accessibility field.
Well, we need data, which means we need platforms. And, how well are the platforms that I'm looking at my data and analytics through, are they conforming? Like where does this mishmash of almost like you were saying, placing responsibility in other places? How about the vendors that we use to look at our own data analysis, or our
Right.
user heat maps and platforms that are internal tooling?
So it's hard to tell if people don't disclose. Then there's the other thing that a lot of, like, 70% of disabilities are invisible. So, I could be sitting, here talking to you with, like, and having severe depression or anxiety, or, or I could be extremely hard of hearing, and you wouldn't be able to know that unless I present certain aspects. And, a lot of people don't. So, we tend to assume that everybody's able because, we don't really question that assumption.
Do you think we missed any of the big macro challenges?
Well, back to economics, there's the fact that a lot of solutions for accessibility and testing really relate to very, very large companies. So it's like Fortune 500 companies, government, education, those are really the ones that have been, like, focusing very strongly on accessibility. And on the other hand, something like 70% of GDP, world GDP comes from small, medium-sized businesses. So we're not addressing this. We're kind of like got an approach that's very short tail. It's very bespoke. It's very manual. It's very labor intensive. And somehow we need to figure out if 98% of the web is inaccessible, as according to WebAIM, and we want to turn that into 98% of the web being accessible. We really, really need to address that long tail, and it needs to be profitable, to work with that long tail. So unfortunately, right now, like, the only companies that are really addressing that are overlay companies, and their products don't match their claims, and they do the most superficial kind of accessibility conformance. So we need to get ourselves to a point where we're actually delivering on the promise that those overlay companies have been making, but that we actually have tools that are robust enough and work well enough to really mitigate those issues.
So these top level challenges, I'm sure in the course of your tenure in accessibility, has led to some personal challenges getting to where you want to see this focus go.
Yeah. There's the issue of scalability. Like, when I was working with a major cruise firm, I felt like I was like one person, and I was like trying to boil the ocean. So it's kind of like, how well, even those of us who are working in this, how well do we scale within the organizations that we're working for? And then there's the economics of, you work in accessibility. Like, for me, my experiences as a creative director or as a senior designer, the salary I could command is much greater than what I could as an accessibility expert with a background in design. So it's kind of like, should I have transitioned over full time, or should I just kind of stayed in the design profession and then kind of added accessibility as kind of a specialty on top of that?
I don't know. I no comment on that one. I think that's brutally wrong, and it's. We were just a quick statistic, really quickly. Like, we're doing a bunch of research on companies that have adopted accessibility, companies that are looking to buy accessibility, and we have access to various data sources that help us do this. And 75% of the companies that we've looked at don't have anyone across the content supply that has exposure to accessibility. And it's like, where's the investment? I don't know. It kind of. Sorry, didn't mean to go into
No,
what's
it's
going
like
on here. Your claim just it's yeah.
You have pockets. Maybe it's just like, we're at the stage where we have like these little footholds in large organizations, where we're starting to work down, and, we're at the very beginning of some sort of trickle down with accessibility. I worked for a while in hospitality at a company that had like an army of like 20, 30 people handling accessibility.
Yeah.
And is that the norm? Is that, the way to go? It could be. I mean, it could be that maybe you have a center of excellence and you have a team of 5 experts, but you have the accessibility knowledge spread out, with your designers, your developers, your product managers, your stakeholders. So really, that I think is more efficient in terms of way of running accessibility, but it's going to take some culture change to get there.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully conversations like this drive the culture change that we feel so passionate about.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and that's a tough one because that culture change is a much longer view than fixing a website. So you get a lawsuit, you know, as a major brand, you're going to throw a team at it, try to clean up everything that there is, and that's like a reactive approach. And that is definitely not, thinking culture change in your organization. It's okay. How do we, and a lot of times the funding will come out of like the slip and fall fund, so what you would be paying, for people who are suing your brand. What you really need is you need a sustainable program, and then you have to think of some sort of long-term goal where that accessibility knowledge is spread out enough in your organization where your organization is just it's culturally inclusive of people with disabilities, and that's a pretty high bar to try to meet.
Yeah, I mean, there's expectations that we have this inclusivity um, in other manners, and you've said it now. I think this is second, third time where it's like if you begin with the end in mind, it's really there's even less of an effort, right? If creative and design and development and QA and the roles are trained on it, and the um, methodologies and the strategies are made clear, accessibility is easy. And there was a particular conversation I got into with a fairly one of the three larger global creative agencies, and they're looking to try to tie it to media effectiveness, and that there is an ROI behind this, and that it's this investment pays off, and it's not about an investment paying off, right? There's a equal playing field
Right.
component of what accessibility is and why it's important, but and I guess there's always the, you know, are you a one person team trying to ratchet down a, 1,000, 10,000 plus person org? So how far are you going to get?
It's that, you start kind of working your way towards like the real core sort of assets, like if you're in your UX or your development organization, you're going to want to start like working your way into the design system where you're creating the master components that are repeated elsewhere. So instead of fixing 60 instances of the same component, you're fixing the one instance that the other 60 are being copied off. And, that takes, from an accessibility point of view, I mean, it takes a lot to mine the organization well enough to the point where you're comfortable enough with the folks that are working with those, code repositories, those design systems, those component libraries, to have a seat at the table and be able to review stuff for accessibility. But that's where a huge part of the cost savings happen. If
So
you're a
you've driven
company
cost savings, right? So it's not all doom and gloom. We've talked about some of the challenges.
right.
There's got to be wins that we can use as a level of excitement and encouragement to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the toughest things dealing with accessibility in a large enterprise is really if you're dealing with it because you got an accessibility lawsuit, that is absolutely the most expensive way to be able to handle it. Because essentially you're coming in after your digital experience is already in production, it's already, baked, and then you have to go back and refactor to make it compliant. And it is so much many orders of magnitude more expensive to do that than to be factoring in the accessibility from the beginning and testing as you go to make sure that you're not inadvertently bringing barriers in. So that's a process that a lot of us in the accessibility called shifting left, because you're shifting left in the timeline. You know, you're shifting left in terms of when, in what stages you're addressing accessibility. So ideally, you're going to get to a point where you're addressing a lot of these issues. Like if you're doing the double diamond sort of approach, you're addressing it in problem definition. So if you're building a new product, say autonomous vehicles or Hyperloop or something like that, you're like, how do I build a product that serves people with disabilities right from the beginning? And if it's a like say you're doing a ride share with autonomous vehicles, your hardest, most difficult use case is going to be somebody with a power wheelchair. So good luck if you're working for different size passengers and then you don't think of how you address a power wheelchair, and then it gets mandated that you do need to address this, and then you're going to run into a major problem. But
Well, the
those
business
sorts of
model
things,
then doesn't work.
yeah, exactly. So you need to as designers, those of us who design need to like think about that stuff at the beginning. And so a lot of accessibility, a lot of the culture change is how do you innovate accessibly.
And how have you done that? Like, tell me, what are you most proud of?
um Well, a lot of it is definitely like writing, teaching, evangelizing, getting people to have the sort of light bulb moment, where they get an understanding of this. Um, from a data point of view, I mean, I've done a lot of stuff with data that it worked in different ways than my peers do in accessibility. Some of it, for instance, is we've got all these platforms for tracking accessibility issues. Um, I don't think any of those platforms are really doing enough to allow people to mine that data well. And if you can start dicing and slicing by business unit, by actual flaws, you've mentioned, and you and I have talked before about like
Yeah, I'm a
churn
data guy. I love data. So
and that sort of thing. And it's like we could do better. But on the flip side, if you're building a web interface for one of these platforms, you can't anticipate all the different ways that people are going to use it. So I've developed this whole workflow for taking that data, bringing it through an API, and then using it through Power BI to like start doing all kinds of dicing and slicing and visualization. And some of the cooler stuff is you can quantify your legal risk, like with a major brand, and you can actually track that legal risk over time. And so it starts becoming a combination of different things, but you can start looking at the lawsuits, what people are suing your brand for, and then tracking those specific infractions and seeing how you're scoring with those.
I love it. I mean, the tenure that you have in the space gives you a pretty unique perspective on where accessibility has come from, where it's going, the successes, having designed a front end interface for Wave. You've implemented accessibility in really large organizations. I'd love to close out with a question about where's accessibility going? Where technology is disrupting everywhere.
Right.
Is technology going to disrupt accessibility?
It is, but probably in a different way from the way everybody's anticipating. Like everybody's jumping on the AI, or more specifically, like the Chat GPT bandwagon. I
Mm,
don't, I do think automation and AI are going to like really impact accessibility, but I don't think it's going to be Chat GPT that's going to be doing it. Accessibility, it needs to be more scalable. It needs to be more affordable. When I started in accessibility, the automated tools would only capture maybe 40% of the issues that were out there. So there have been some companies that have been really pushing aggressively and they've nudged that over 50%. But then, like, what do you do with the other 50% of issues? So that's sort of that remaining percentage is kind of today it needs manual testing or auditing, and it needs user testing. And so I think a lot of that gap necessarily needs to be filled in with automated testing, and automated where have a bot that can find this, and you have some sort of automation that's driving the bot and driving the bot in new environments like CI/CD. That you know a lot of what we're doing now is just tracking accessibility in production, which is kind of not the most
yeah,
efficient or
it's too
productive
late.
way to do it. Exactly.
Well, and
Exactly.
It's like we have automated tests when we build software and we bring it to production. We have tools for monitoring user experience on a website and ensuring really quality user experience. So it's I don't know. I'm like, we can democratize these tools even more, and we can see tools specifically focused to accessibility take what's already working within the organization: automated QA testing,
Right.
analytics, visibility into heat maps, and apply it to accessibility.
Right.
So what's driving this? Are we going to see like a magic aha moment? Like how are we going to realize automation and these innovations that you speak with conviction about?
So I kind of think right now we're kind of a little bit in a chicken and egg sort of situation where like the folks that really have great knowledge of the different kinds of AI, computer vision, natural entity recognition, code whisperer apps, stuff that could work towards like doing code remediation. The folks who have that knowledge, accessibility is not top of their list of areas to want to work in. It's not going to be the most profitable area. By the same token, the folks that work in accessibility, a lot of folks are really invested in these sort of bespoke processes. So they're not necessarily going to be super excited about adopting and learning new technologies. Somehow there's got to be like a small set of us who are kind of like in that intersection of being AI knowledgeable and being committed to accessibility. That's where I think like the innovation is going to be going to be coming from. But I think it's definitely going to be, how do we take a lot of the stuff that was done traditionally with manual testing and make it automatable? And I think automation, is going to be the key. So not, and that's separately from using AI as well. I mean, you got AI to evaluate stuff, but you got automation to drive and schedule and manage the testing.
And take action, right? Because it can't be, passing a baton is waiting on the next person. Let's make autonomous decisions. So, Claudio, so much. I mean, we're gonna schedule part 2 right now because we could go on. I want to give an opportunity. The conversation, progressed fairly quickly. So much insight, but anything else that I can, we can lend the floor and for folks that are listening to take away?
I would say like back to the whole economics, like how do you make the business case for accessibility? And we kind of talked about technical debt, and I don't know if people have like really addressed that well enough. Like, how do you calculate the technical debt coming from accessibility flaws? The sort of stuff that I've done is kind of like back of the envelope calculations, but I'd be, super curious to see how other people have been trying to address this, because it's really, if you don't account for that, you're really, jumping into something without any of the insight you really need.
Well, sounds like everyone has a little bit of critical thinking and hopefully today a different way of thinking that you've opened up our eyes for. So I want to thank you again. Always such a wealth of knowledge and an enjoyable conversation. And thank you again, Claudia.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you all for listening.